I'm Dave Foster, and I don't know who came further tonight. John Brownlee, who came from Roanoke, or Dave Foster, who came from Arlington. Ideologically, I think, John, I got you beat here. And I want to tell you a little bit about how I managed to win there. I just wrapped up 8 years on their school board, 2 terms as chairman, and what that tells you about my candidacy for Attorney General. But let me say first, I thought of you actually today as I cleaned up my law office. Began the process I have to do every 4 years of cleaning up my office, because Fulbright and Jaworski, my law firm, sits right on Pennsylvania Avenue, 9th Pennsylvania. And we have a little party. I'm not celebrating this time, actually, myself, but we have a little party every time there's a new president inaugurated, because he comes right down Pennsylvania Avenue below our windows. Great place to party and watch the parade. And as I started cleaning up, I found on the windowsill of my window a cartridge. And I thought, Dave, this is not going to look good when the Secret Service comes through in a couple of weeks to do the sweep before the parade. There's a long story behind this about my daughter's first skeet shooting when I took her out there, but I don't think either I or the guy who had to dive out of the tower that day is going to want to hear it. So I'll put that away and go back to Arlington. Let me tell you a little bit about my background, though, and how I got there. As you can tell by the hair color, I've been around longer than these guys, and many of you too. Actually, my family's been around a long time. My grandfather, 7 generations back, came to Williamsburg about 1653. He was a military man himself, knew something about guns, but he was in the Scottish Army, unfortunately, when Cromwell ran over him. So he heeded those words, "Go west, young man," and came to Williamsburg. A couple of centuries later, 18th century, my family was carving out a cabin in a small farm in the southern part of Albemarle County, which Martha and I own to this day. I'll be down there this weekend doing a little hunting with my brother. And that's where I met her, actually, at the University of Virginia, nearby that farm. We came back to Arlington in 1981. I've raised 2 children, both of whom are in Virginia colleges now. And along the way, we got very involved in our church and our community. I had the honor of being president of the Civic Federation in Arlington twice, several nonprofit boards. And yes, the bug struck me, and I ran for public office. I didn't pick a good year the first time. Anybody here remember 1994? Ollie North and I did not do well in Arlington, but I didn't give up. I ran again in '99 against the wife of Delegate Al Eisenberg. I think many of you know that name. And we beat her when it was all said and done by 7 votes per precinct. First time the Democrat had lost a general election in Arlington since 1983. It still only happened twice in the last quarter century, because the other time was when I won re-election in 2003 with over 62% of the vote. Now, we didn't do that by abandoning the common sense conservative principles I think most of the people in this room, including me, hold dear. My background in the Republican Party, which I would bet is fairly well represented here, goes very deep. I was Bob Daniels' legislative director in the 70s when he held down the 4th congressional district for us. I chaired Go Pack Virginia last year, going around the state raising money for candidates like Senator Cuccinelli and doing seminars for up-and-coming local candidates on how to wage effective campaigns. I chaired John Warner's re-election campaign in Arlington, where thank God, that year we managed to fight to withdraw a young up-and-coming Democrat named Mark Warner, or otherwise he might have taken the Senate seat then. But I didn't abandon any of those principles to win or to govern in Arlington. Instead, I articulated those principles and applied them. Let me give you a couple of examples, and then I wanted to move to the issue that concerns, I know, most of you. I ran for office against a school board that was spending money, believe it or not, defending the system of racial preferences in school admissions. I thought it was clearly unconstitutional, unfair, and stupid, because they were spending a lot of money on private attorneys trying to defend this system. And I was being proven right by the courts. They kept throwing it out. My first term on the school board, they dropped that, and we quit spending tax money on that silly system. Bonds. We had to build and renovate schools like most of the districts in this area at a fairly fast pace. I said, don't put all this debt on future generations. Take some of what we get every year in our operating budget and put that into capital construction. And when I was chairman, we did that. We had the smallest bond in real dollar terms that the School Board of Arlington had had in 20 years. That's the sort of, and one small example. It may seem small to you, it doesn't to me, of how a common sense principle and one person can make a difference, even in the People's Republic of Arlington. When I joined the board, it didn't always say the Pledge of Allegiance before every meeting. It always had the flag back there, but if the color guard of students wasn't there to bring in the flag, they wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance. I said, why? Why don't we do that for every meeting? Well, you're the only Republican. We don't have to answer that. When I became chairman for the first time, I didn't ask them their opinion. I gavelled that first meeting to order, And I stood up and I said, will you join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance? Guess what? Every one of them stood up, said the Pledge of Allegiance, and they still do that to this day before every meeting. So we don't have to give up any principles to be effective in government and to make sure that common sense conservative solutions prevail. And that's the attitude I'll bring to the Attorney General's office. I'm already working on it. There's a letter back there that we sent yesterday to the State Board of Elections because some of the people who know best how to use firearms, the brave men in uniform and women in uniform who are representing us and defending us overseas, their votes aren't being counted by your State Board of Elections, hundreds of them, because they were late. Why were they late? The electoral boards themselves failed to mail those ballots out, absentee ballots out in time. And your State Board of Elections, not represented by the Attorney General, but by a private law firm, is spending your tax dollars fighting a Justice Department suit saying count those ballots. I weighed in with my opinion yesterday saying count those ballots. That can't cost any more than this law firm defending that litigation, and it's the right thing to do. Of all people, those defending our freedoms overseas ought to have the right to exercise their vote back here. So that's the attitude I'll take into this job, and and then I will open it up to questions to your concerns about the Second Amendment, because they're my concerns. I work a few blocks down the street, as I just told you, from Supreme Court, where the 9 justices early this summer decided that, correctly so, that the Second Amendment is a fundamental individual right, not tied just to the need to maintain militia, a fundamental individual right, not to be infringed by government at any level. Although that last question remains to be seen, because this came out of the District of Columbia. But keep that in mind. Your Attorney General, he's not a prosecutor, with all due deference to a great prosecutor in John Brownlee. He's not a legislator, with all deference to a great legislator like Ken Cuccinelli. He runs the 3rd largest law firm in Virginia. He's responsible for 250 attorneys that represent you in civil, constitutional, and criminal matters. And this is one that may yet be determined in the near future how far that Second Amendment right articulated by the Supreme Court extends. But they only did it by 1 vote. It was a 5-4 decision. That ought to give us all pause. We have to remain vigilant with all our Bill of Rights, including the one that, after all, the Founding Fathers made second. It's ahead of habeas corpus, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment, the right to trial jury. It's number 2, right behind the First Amendment, freedom of expression rights. It was held by 5-4. Now, some of the attacks on the Second Amendment are pretty open and notorious. Let's talk about the gun show loophole. Everybody here knows it's not a loophole. Virginia doesn't regulate private transfers of firearms. I said I'll be hunting this weekend on my farm in Albemarle County with my brother. If he ever gives up one of his prized rifles to me, I don't have to do a background check, and he doesn't either. Whether it's at a gun show or at the farm. It's not a loophole, it's the same rule everywhere. Other attacks on the amendment are a bit more subtle. Before the GOP convention last May, I was on the platform committee. We endorsed a resolution asking that Congress tell the Park Service to do what you just heard about, eliminate the federal ban on carrying firearms in national parks. When in national parks, many of them are very isolated, and they can be dangerous. There have been assaults, and as we well know in Virginia, even murders in national parks. Why should state rules not govern national parks? And that's what the resolution we passed called for. Let that question be determined by the rule of the state, in this case Virginia, where the national park is. And I'm glad to hear progress is being made on it at the end of the Bush administration. It's too bad it's this late, because I can bet you there'll be some challenges to it and some reversals in the next one if we're not careful. But we've got to be vigilant against open attacks on the amendment and against the subtle attacks on the amendment. Now, I didn't fill out, as some of you know, because I know you're unhappy about it. You told me so, and I appreciate that, the survey questionnaire. Because there were many things on there, despite what I just said about my positions on Second Amendment rights, that I couldn't give a yes-no answer to. I wanted to hear more about things that involve local options before I gave you a yes-no. Because one thing I'll never do is mislead you. I wouldn't tell you a yes to win your support. That's the question. That's the answer you want to hear. And then, serving as your Attorney General, decide time to change. I'll deal with it up front. And I extend that courtesy to everybody else I will represent. But, as you can tell, that's where I'm coming from on Second Amendment issues. It's a fundamental constitutional right. that we must be vigilant to protect, because the fight isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. That's where I'm coming from, a little bit about who I am, how I got here, and why I want to be your next Attorney General. If you're from the Republican side of the aisle, I hope you'll think the fact I won and won big in Arlington means I can help our statewide ticket next year. If you're from the Democratic side of the aisle, well, a lot of your friends agreed with me, re-elected me. Either way, I hope you will agree I can bring something to this office, including deep legal training and sound constitutional and common sense conservative principles that will represent your interest well. And with that, I'm going to shut up, Dennis, and give your colleagues a chance to ask what's on your mind.